He's running. Van Niekerk is right there with him. Glaive is right there with him. And then Jacobs just pulls away like the rope connecting him to the rest of the field snapped. 9.67. Say that number slowly. 9.67 seconds for 100 meters. In the entire history of the human race, only one man has ever covered that distance faster than that, under any conditions, legal or not. And it isn't a Jamaican. It isn't an American, even though he was born in America. It's an Italian. Except even that isn't fully true, because the man who just posted the fastest wind-aided 100 meters ever recorded on a stopwatch was born in a hospital in El Paso, Texas, to an American soldier who was gone from his life 20 days after he arrived on this earth. Stay with me for the next 20-something minutes, because I'm going to take you through every single piece of this. Not just the race in Austria last week. All of it. The lake town in Italy where he grew up without a father. The Facebook friend requests he never answered. The sport he was actually building his identity around before a knee injury tore it away from him. The mental coach who told him, flat out, that his legs were locking up in the blocks because of an emotional wound and not a physical one. The phone call to America that he says changed the entire trajectory of his career. The gold medal in Tokyo that nobody saw coming. The 2 years of injuries and disasters that followed it. The move to Florida to train next to a rival who used to beat him. The collapse in Paris in front of the whole world. And then, after all of that, a Wednesday evening in a small Austrian city called Eisenstadt, where a 31-year-old man ran the third fastest 100 meters in the history of the sport. By the time we get to the end of this, you're going to understand something. This was never really a story about sprinting. It's a story about a kid who spent his whole life trying to answer one question, and how chasing that answer, whether he meant to or not, turned him into one of the fastest human beings who has ever lived. Let's go all the way back, because you need the beginning to understand any of the rest of it. In the early 90s, a United States Army soldier is stationed in Italy. He's American, from Texas originally, and while he's over there he meets a girl. She's 16 years old. Italian. From a small town on the shores of Lake Garda called Desenzano del Garda, the kind of place most Americans have never heard of and probably never will. Postcard water, mountains in the background, tourists in the summer, quiet the rest of the year. The two of them fall for each other, the way people do when they're young and the timing is terrible. She gets pregnant. The Army reassigns him back to a base in Texas, in El Paso, and instead of staying behind, she goes with him. A teenage girl, barely out of high school age, crossing an ocean for a man and a baby that hasn't even been born yet. The baby arrives. They name him Lamont Marcell Jacobs. And for 20 days, he has something that looks, from the outside, like a normal family. A mother, a father, a name on a birth certificate with both of their surnames tied together forever, whether either of them wanted that or not. Then the Army moves the father again, this time to South Korea. And that's it. That's the whole window. 20 days. A newborn, a teenage mother thousands of miles from her own family, stationed on a base in a country that isn't hers, in a language she's still learning, with no husband, no plan, and no idea what happens next. She does the only thing that makes sense. She packs up her son and she goes home. Back across the ocean. Back to Desenzano del Garda. Back to the lake. Back to her parents. Back to a life that was supposed to look completely different than the one she's now living as a very young single mother raising an American baby in an Italian town. That's where Marcell grows up. Not with stories about his father. Not with photographs on the wall or a voice on the phone every Sunday. With absence. With a name that sounds American in a place that is completely Italian. With a question that never really has an answer because nobody's actually there to give him one. Why didn't he come back? Here's the part that a lot of people who grew up with an absent parent are going to recognize immediately. Marcell didn't get closure. He didn't get a sit-down conversation where his father explained himself, apologized, tried to make it right. He got silence. Years and years of silence. And then social media arrived, the way it did for all of us, and one day his father is right there. Findable. A profile with a name and a face. And the father actually does reach out. He sends friend requests. More than one, over time. Marcell doesn't answer. Not once. For years. In interviews much later in his life, when journalists finally ask him about it, he doesn't soften the language. He calls the man a stranger. Not my father. Not my dad. A stranger. And he says, without hesitating, that not having a father in his life shaped basically everything about who he became. The walls he built, the fear underneath the walls. All of it traces back to one man who left when he was 3 weeks old and then tried to reconnect through a friend request 20-some years later. If any part of that is landing for you right now, if that's your story or somebody close to you, sit with it for a second, because it's about to matter a lot more than you'd expect for a story that's supposedly about running fast. Now here's a detail almost nobody outside of Italy actually knows. Sprinting was not Marcell's sport. Not originally. Not even close. He built his entire athletic identity, his entire sense of who he was as an athlete, around the long jump. That was his event. That was the thing he was good at, the thing coaches noticed him for, the thing he saw as his future. And then in 2018, a knee injury takes it away from him. Not gradually. Not a slow decline he can see coming and prepare for emotionally. It's just gone, the way things get taken from him. So what does a 24-year-old long jumper with a ruined knee and no more long jump career do? He switches to the 100 meters. And I want to be clear about something, because it gets romanticized after the fact in almost every version of this story you'll find online. This was not some grand strategic vision. Nobody looked at him and said, "This man is destiny's sprinter." This was desperation. He's 24 years old, which in sprinting terms is already late to be starting fresh in a new event, and his first legal 100-meter time on record is a 10.08. If you don't follow track, let me translate that for you. That is not a world-class time. That is a, well, let's see if this goes anywhere time. That is the time of a guy who might be running club meets in 3 years, not a guy who's about to become an Olympic champion. So take stock of where he's at right now in this story. His father left before he could walk. The one sport he built his identity around is gone. He's starting completely over, in a new event, at an age most sprinters are already established in, with a time that doesn't turn any heads. 2 things have already abandoned this guy in his life. His father, and then his own sport. Both gone before most of the track and field world even knew his name existed. This is where the story stops being a normal athletic comeback arc and starts getting genuinely strange. At the end of 2020, Marcell brings a mental coach into his camp. Her name is Nicoletta Romanazzi. And in one of their very first sessions together, she tells him something that, if you said it to most athletes, would sound almost absurd. She tells him that his legs are locking up right before races. Not because of a technical flaw in his start. Not because of anything his sprint coach could fix with a drill. Because of his father. She lays it out for him. The tension. The heaviness right before the gun goes off. The anxiety that shows up in his legs at exactly the moment he needs them to be loose and explosive. She tells him all of it is coming from one unresolved place. A wound he has never actually dealt with, just carried around and built a career on top of. The father who disappeared. And she tells him something even harder to hear. He is not going to become the fastest man in the world while he's still carrying that weight around unaddressed. He has to face it head on. He has to reach out. Think about how strange this must have felt from the inside. This is an American father. Not some distant relative back in Italy he could visit once and be done with. An actual American man, living his life somewhere in the United States right now, completely unaware, or maybe fully aware and just not acting on it, that his son is training to become one of the fastest sprinters alive. The wound is American, which means if Marcell is actually going to do what his coach is asking, the healing has to cross an ocean too. So he does it. After more than 2 decades of silence, of ignored friend requests, of calling the man a stranger to journalists, Marcell reaches out to his father. Real phone calls, real text messages. And here's the detail that makes it feel human instead of cinematic. A lot of it goes through Google Translate, because his English isn't strong, and they're 2 people trying to have the most important conversation of their lives through a language barrier and a translation app. It is not smooth. It is not a movie reunion with swelling music. It's awkward. It's slow. It's uncomfortable in the way real reconciliation almost always is. 2 people trying to build 25 years of relationship out of a phone screen, a few messages at a time, while one of them is simultaneously trying to become an Olympic champion. Before we get to what happens next, I want you to actually sit with a question, because it's the exact question Marcell had to answer for himself. If somebody told you that reaching out to the parent who abandoned you was the only way to unlock the thing you'd been chasing your whole life, would you make that call? Not an easy question. Marcell made it anyway. A few months later, the entire sport found out what that call led to. August 1st, 2021. Tokyo. The Olympic Stadium, empty of fans because of the pandemic, but every camera in the sport pointed at one race, the men's 100-meter final. And here's the thing. Almost nobody in that building, and almost nobody watching around the world, knows who Lamont Marcell Jacobs is. He is not a favorite. He is barely a name anyone outside of Italy could have picked out of a lineup a year earlier. The gun goes off, and he has, by a wide margin, the slowest reaction time out of the blocks of anyone in that final. In a race decided by hundredths of a second, he's already behind before his feet have really left the blocks. And then he runs every single one of them down. 9.80 seconds. A European record. Olympic gold. The first Italian in the entire history of the event to even reach an Olympic 100-meter final, let alone stand on top of the podium at the end of it. Fred Kerley, the American everybody expected to take that gold, finishes second. Trayvon Bromell, one of the fastest men alive at that point in time, doesn't even make the final. And the man who wins it is somebody born in El Paso, Texas, raised by a teenage mother on the shores of an Italian lake, who switched sports at 24 out of pure desperation, who spent over 2 decades refusing to answer his own father's friend requests, and who, a few months earlier, picked up the phone and called that same man a stranger no more. That man is now, officially, the fastest man on the planet. If you were following the sport around that same period, you might also remember another name that made headlines for a different kind of milestone. Sam Blaskowski clocking 9.89 and becoming known as the fastest white man in recorded history. I bring that up because it tells you something about the moment sprinting was in right then. The sport was suddenly full of names nobody had predicted a few years earlier, and Marcell's name, out of nowhere, was sitting right at the very top of that list. But here's the thing about stories like this. Real life doesn't let anybody stay at the top without a fight. And what happens to Marcell over the next few years is the part that gets cut out of almost every highlight reel, because it isn't triumphant, it's just hard. The years right after Tokyo start falling apart for him, piece by piece. He develops an inflamed sciatic nerve in his thigh, the kind of injury that doesn't heal cleanly and doesn't respond well to just resting it. He starts pulling out of races, withdrawing from championships he was expected to headline. At one especially low point, he ends up in a hospital bed in Kenya, not because of anything track-related at all, but because of a stomach virus, about as far from a track and an Olympic podium as you can get. Then at the 2023 World Championships, the reigning Olympic champion doesn't even make the final. He runs a season's best time in the semifinal, and it still isn't enough to get him through. He goes home early, from the same kind of stage where, 2 years earlier, he'd made history. Sit with what that actually does to a person for a second. You claw your way up from a 10.08 to an Olympic gold medal. You become, officially, the fastest man alive. And then your own body turns on you, again and again, for 2 straight years, while a new wave of sprinters, no allows very much included, start pulling away with the sport in your absence. That's not just a bad stretch of form. That's watching the thing you fought your whole life for slip through your fingers in real time, in front of everybody. So Marcell makes a brutal decision. He leaves his longtime coach, the same coach who took him from a struggling long jumper with a bad knee all the way to Olympic gold, and he uproots his entire life. He moves to Jacksonville, Florida, to train under a new coach, in a training group that includes, of all people, Trayvon Bromell, the same sprinter who couldn't even make that Tokyo final back when Marcell won it. Now they're training side by side, every single day, an Italian Olympic champion trying to rebuild himself from almost nothing, in a country that is, in the strangest possible way, both his birthplace and completely foreign to him. Which, if you think back to where this whole story started, is a fairly fitting place for him to end up. By 2024, he says the injuries are finally behind him. He walks into Paris as the defending Olympic champion. Confident, healthy, ready to defend the title that turned him into a legend back home in Italy. Paris, August 4th, 2024. The 100-meter final. Marcell barely even qualifies, sneaking into the final as one of the fastest losers out of the semifinal round rather than winning his heat outright. From the gun, it's absurdly tight, a blanket finish where the entire field is separated by almost nothing at all. Noah Lyles crosses the line first in 9.784 seconds. Kishane Thompson takes silver. Fred Kerley takes bronze. And Marcell finishes fifth in 9.85. He's seen limping off the track afterward. Not celebrating anything. Not defending anything. Just gone, in the space of about 10 seconds, from the reigning fastest man on Earth to fifth place in his own Olympic title defense. I wanted to be the one celebrating, he says afterward. But my career doesn't end here. 3 years of pain. A country change. A coaching change. All of it. And it still wasn't enough on the biggest stage the sport has to offer. That's where we leave him for a moment. Fifth place. Limping. With nothing left to hold on to except whatever faith he still has in himself. Which brings us to last week. Wednesday, July 1st, 2026. Eisenstadt, Austria, a modest city hosting a modest-sized meet on the World Athletics Continental Tour, nothing like the scale of an Olympic final. Marcell Jacobs lines up for the 100-meter final. He gets a slow start again, trailing Britain's Romel Glave and 400-meter world record holder Wade van Niekerk. And then, once he's into full stride, he simply pulls away from both of them, winning by roughly a full meter at the line. The clock reads 9.67. Now, here's the honest part, because you deserve the full truth here and not just the headline. That run came with a tailwind of plus 4.1 meters per second, more than double the legal limit of 2.0 meters per second allowed for a time to count toward any official record. So no, it does not go into the record books. It will never be called a national record, a European record, or anything close to it, officially speaking. But strip away that technicality for 1 second and just look at the raw number sitting on the clock. In the entire recorded history of the 100 meters, under any conditions at all, legal or aided, only 2 performances have ever been faster than what Marcell Jacobs just ran in Eisenstadt, and both of them belong to the same man. Usain Bolt, with his 9.58 world record from Berlin in 2009, and his wind-aided 9.63 from the London Olympics in 2012. That makes Jacobs' 9.67 the third fastest 100 meters ever run by a human being, in any conditions, in the history of the sport. Behind Bolt twice. Ahead of literally everyone else who has ever lived. A 31-year-old man, born in Texas, raised by a teenage mother in a small town on an Italian lake, who lost his original sport to a knee injury and switched events out of desperation at 24, who spent over 2 decades calling the father who abandoned him a stranger, who was told by a mental coach that the anxiety locking up his legs before races traced directly back to that unresolved wound, who picked up the phone and made an awkward, Google Translate-assisted call across an ocean because he was told it was the only way to become who he was capable of becoming, who won Olympic gold in Tokyo, who then fell apart physically for 2 straight years and finished outside the podium at a world championship he once ruled, who uprooted his life to Florida and trained next to a man who used to beat him, who limped off the track in 5th place in Paris in 2024 saying his career wasn't over. That man just answered every single one of his doubters with a 9.67 in a small city in Austria. Say the number one more time. 9.67, third fastest 100 meters in the history of the sport. Only Usain Bolt, and only Usain Bolt twice, has ever gone faster, win legal or not. And here's the piece that ties this entire story together. The piece that turns it from a good comeback story into something a little more remarkable than that. After Tokyo, back in 2021, reporters asked Marcell what had actually changed for him. What was the difference between the guy running at 10.08 and the guy who just won Olympic gold? And he didn't talk about sprint mechanics. He didn't talk about training blocks or start technique or any of the technical language you'd expect from a professional athlete answering that question. He talked about his mental coach and the very first thing she ever told him, that he needed to build a relationship with the father he never had. He has called it, on the record, the hardest thing he has ever done in his entire life. Harder than any race he has ever run, including the Olympic final that made him a champion. The phone call to America wasn't a footnote in this story. According to Marcell Jacobs himself, in his own words, it was the reason. The 9.67 in Austria, the gold medal in Tokyo, all of it traces back to a call he made to a man he used to call a stranger. So where does this go from here? Speaking of Jacobs, he says he's now healthy again after an injury-disrupted 2025, and this season he's already broken the 10-second barrier 4 separate times, with the European Championships in Birmingham coming up in August, where he'll be chasing a third consecutive continental title. But the number everyone is actually going to be watching for is the one 2 years down the road. Los Angeles, 2028. The country where he was born. The state his father calls home. A city that, in a strange and almost poetic way, sits right at the intersection of both halves of who this man is. He'll be 33 years old, lining up for an Olympic final on American soil for the very first time in his life, against the best sprinters alive on the planet, with a 9.67 already sitting on the board behind his name. Does Lamont Marcell Jacobs stand on that starting line in Los Angeles, in the country his father never left, and walk away with a second Olympic gold medal on what is, in every sense that matters, his own home soil? Drop your answer below. Every single comment gets read.